We know that our podcast inspires learning professionals like you in your day-to-day work because you've told us. Now here's a chance to showcase the innovative, evidence-based solutions you've created in your day-to-day work. The Learning Technologies Awards 2024 are open for entries. With 20 categories, including the new Best Use of AI in Learning, your groundbreaking work can win global recognition. Apply by July the 26th and elevate your team's achievements to new heights. Apply today at learningtechnologiesawards, all one word, .co.uk. That's learningtechnologiesawards.co.uk.
Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to a new episode of Great Minds on Learning. In this highly acclaimed series, Professor Donald Clark, internationally famous author, blogger and entrepreneur, joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of thought and theorising about learning from the Greeks to the geeks. At the end of the 19th century, a split in philosophy emerged that persists today. The Analytic tradition led by Frege, Husserl and Wittgenstein emphasised clarity, logical rigour and formal methods in language analysis. By contrast, Continental Theorists such as Husserl and Heidegger went to a very different place. They focused on human experience and took on broader cultural and political themes, giving us terms like existentialism, structuralism, post-structuralism and postmodernism. In this final episode of the season, we explore the impact of Continental Theorists. What influence have these radical thinkers, whose writings often seem almost willfully obscure, had on education and learning?
I'm in love with a Jacques Derrida. Read a page and I know what I need to. Take apart my baby's heart. I'm in love. These are lyrics from a song called Jacques Derrida, or more properly Derrida, I suppose, released in 1982 by Scritti Politti, a UK post-punk band. And I quote them here to point up the influence that the group of thinkers we're dealing with this time, Derrida among them, had on impressionable young minds back in the 70s and 80s, not least mine, and not only sur le continent. It might seem bizarre that Jacques Derrida, French post-structuralist author of some pretty impenetrable texts, should have become a name for pretentious British pop stars to drop, but the influence of continental philosophy on culture in this period was pretty pervasive. You saw it in music, literature, art, films, and also in higher education. A few years after I left university, where I'd studied English literature, I happened to bump into a previous tutor of mine on a train, and he was beside himself with rage at the way Continental Theorists seemed to have completely hypnotized the new intake. All they want to know about is theory, he complained. Practical criticism, or prac-crit, which was close analysis of text, the way we used to study literature, was out of the door. Now everything had to be deconstructed. Many people might not be that familiar with this group of people, but the way they think is in some measure shaped by it because the influence has been so pervasive. And that influence has continued, and a lot of people still don't like it, just like my tutor. Donald, as you know, my learning style is YouTube Wikipedia, and researching this episode, I found an absolute fire hose of negative opinion from commentators on YouTube, subjecting some of the theorists we're dealing with today to excoriating criticism and basically blaming them for the downfall of Western society. However, before we get into it today, just a bit of housekeeping. This is the last episode of the series officially, sad, but we're planning to do a Q&A episode a bit later, in a couple of months' time, where you, the listener, can send in any questions at all you might have about the subjects we've covered in these 6 seasons so far. And we will do our best to answer them, mostly Donald and me making facetious remarks. You can send your questions to me or Donald on social media. We're both on LinkedIn and Twitter X, or to this email address, john@learninghackpodcast.com. So get those burning questions coming in. So now we've got that over with, back to the Continental Theorists and the downfall of Western society. Donald, could you give us an overview of this group and why they have been so influential for learning? And maybe let us know, have you maybe had lunch with any of these theorists?
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
Is that
that's an in-joke because you
right?
mentioned it
Yes.
several times.
Yeah. It's time for the name drop, is it? Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, let's get that one out of the way, really. So, when I was doing postgraduate work at University of Edinburgh on philosophy, Derrida came, and I'm not going to be one of those people, by the way, who call Barcelona or Derrida or whatever. I'm not going to become one of those people. So, forgive my Anglo-Saxon pronunciation of the names. But while I was doing postgraduate work, Derrida comes to university, to the David Hume Tower, where I studied, and they've now stripped the name David Hume from the tower. That is an interesting circle here, because this group are responsible for some of the madness around identity politics, which meant that David Hume himself has been cancelled by a group of young people who actually barely read him. It's now called 26 George Square or something ridiculous. Anyway, afterwards, we went to the faculty club because I was doing work in the same area. And we had an interesting conversation, me and Derrida. So I was doing work on the promiscuousness of language. The idea that language is almost self-generative or hallucinatory around things like prefixes. So you might have the word physical, and that gets turned into metaphysical simply by adding a prefix, or consciousness, unconsciousness, or real, unreal. In other words, language is almost generating these philosophical distinctions itself, rather than them being in any way representative of the real. Anyway, that's how esoteric it was. He disagreed completely, by the way, but we had a good argument. So that was way back in the day. But yeah, let's get back to the little summary here. So we're going to cover 4 people here. The first is Heidegger. The only German in the group, the rest are French, but he's interesting because he's sort of father of sorts of existentialism, and many, of course, all of these thinkers revered Heidegger in one way or another. We'll then go into Foucault, perhaps the most influential of all these thinkers, for all of the wrong reasons, I think, and then Lyotard and Derrida himself. So these thinkers have deep roots, and so deep that they haven't been pulled up yet, and are still massively influential in the humanities in our universities. And many of the common beliefs you'll hear, especially from young people in the pub, as it were, they may not be conscious of it, but much of the language they're using comes from these people as well. I think one of the things that will emerge, is my own personal view, is that their zealotry, and actually the zealotry of some of these thinkers, led them astray. And there's a big warning of almost like a health warning over this episode, which is, in Heidegger's case, his devotion to the state and being, as explicitly stating being and time, and especially his later essays, led to him absolutely adopting National Socialism, banning Jewish professors from his faculty, and riling up his students to believe in Nazism. Foucault was a very different, a sort of reckless reinterpretation of Marx, really, replacing economics with power. That went badly wrong, I think. And then we have Derrida's almost obsession with text, nothing but the text, at the expense of everything else, which led to a sort of inward-looking, introspective view of theory, as you rightly said in your introduction. Lyotard is different because everything's relativistic. He attacks science, he attacks everything into this notion of the personal lived experience as everything. Another very dangerous idea, I think. But we can see where this is going, or at least we can see where my views on this are going. But I think it's also important to uncover what these very interesting thinkers, by the way, also said. So, a health warning, but, let's take a deep dive into each of them and see what they said, specifically in relation to teaching and learning, because that's what the podcast series is about.
Let's get going with Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976. Born in Meschkirch, Germany, Martin Heidegger was raised in a Catholic family, the son of a sexton. He studied theology at the University of Freiburg before switching to philosophy. Heidegger later taught at the University of Marburg and returned to Freiburg as a professor. Known for his seminal work, Being and Time, he influenced existentialism and phenomenology. He's a very big, broad figure, Heidegger. A controversial figure as well. He was a member of the Nazi Party, as you mentioned there, from 1933 to 1945. In Wikipedia, it says he was briefly a member of the Nazi Party, but 33 to 45, that's a significant period of time. He was denazified, as they call it, in the aftermath of war. Fun fact, Heidegger loved hiking in the Black Forest. I've been there and I loved it. In fact, I love Freiburg as well. But I'm afraid that doesn't make me warm to Heidegger the man. As a thinker, though, he was incredibly influential. Donald, your summary of his ideas about learning that I saw on your blog touch on themes we've seen before in these series. Education as a drawing out, not as a stuffing with facts. Teaching as an activity of supporting the learner. So what is distinctive and unique in his take on learning?
Yeah, so I mean, I like Heidegger, especially his masterwork, of course, Being in Time, where a lot of this is discussed, and some of his later essays. But I think we have to get the one thing out of the way a little bit, and that's the Nazi issue, because Heidegger was a Nazi. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And I think if you really want a really detailed, there's a brilliant biography by Rüdiger Safransky on this, which really goes into it in a huge amount of detail. But just to keep it brief, I mean, Heidegger, in a sense, sets the tone for this whole group, in the sense of that we may take philosophers too seriously in our application of their ideas to real life, especially in teaching and learning, because he's fundamentally anti-modernist and therefore anti-technology. And in a very famous essay, The Origins of Art, which is not in Being in Time, no Sign in Sight, he then lays out his ideas of being in the world, a Dasein, and this is a sort of act that founds the political state, namely National Socialism, along with very extreme ideas like extreme sacrifice for students. In other words, you should give your life up for the state. This is the sort of words that Hitler would use. And so it's easy to gloss over this, but his anti-modernism, in a sense, attracted him to National Socialism, aka the Nazis. And he willfully expelled Husserl, the phenomenologist. So you know, his mentor was a Jewish philosopher whom he literally sidelined. He started sacking Jewish faculty and was also, had a more pernicious role in attacking the Jewish students in his faculty. So I think it's very dangerous to sort of dilute that aspect of Heidegger because there's a lesson to be learned from it. Remember, at this time, there's this sense that higher education is always the great sort of, debating side for society. It's very neutral and so on. But at the same time, in the University of Humboldt in Berlin, students, and I stress that word, were burning Jewish books and modernist books in huge bonfires in front of the university. So universities are not always the guiding light on this front. I think it's sometimes forgotten, but this period was, 1930s. This is the early 30s. Some members of faculty here were pernicious on this front, and it wasn't really denazified. The Denazification Commission actually just banned him from teaching. They threw him out. And he was rehabilitated somewhat, but he toned everything down and avoided politics in his later life. Not wholly, but by and large.
But they had tiers, didn't they? Tiers, as part of the denazification process, there were the tiers that people were classified into as to, I suppose, how bad they were, and he was on the lowest.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, he was, in a sense, he was an abstract theorist, a philosopher. He thought actually the whole concept of Dasein should be central to National Socialism. That never worked. They weren't nearly as clever as he thought they were, perhaps, the leaders in National Socialism. Nevertheless, he tried hard to instill his philosophy as a sort of guiding light for the future of the German state, and that didn't work either. So he started playing a very practical role by just, like being anti-Semitic, by and large.
Yeah, but I find Dasein, which you've mentioned there, a very difficult concept to get my head round. And I've always struggled with this, with existentialism in general, in that it kind of feels to me like a lot of what is said about it is either blindingly obvious or tautologous, that being is about being, as it were. But is that just because I grew up in in an era that had been influenced by existentialism, the kind of the removal of religion from life and thought in an important way? Is it just because everything was already existentialism, or is Dasein? Could you tell us a bit more about it? Maybe help me understand it.
Well, it's the one concept, the anchor in Heidegger, and I think it's a really fascinating concept because he was very critical of these metaphysical superstructures that people had built to date. This book was written in the late 1920s, Being in Time, where Dasein is introduced to the world. And these words are, of course, German words and quite difficult to translate in English. But it's probably best, Dasein's probably best described as being in the world, a process of being in the world. He wanted to get rid of the Cartesian distinction between the subject and the objective world and the other metaphysical superstructures that everyone from Plato onwards had built. And he wanted but it was essentially an attack on Cartesianism, getting rid of the subject or self. And what you're left with when you strip all that sort of linguistic templating, you're left with this process of being in the world. We simply are in the world. Dasein. We're just being. So in a sense, you almost have to ignore the word. It sort of dissolves itself in the acid of criticism. But thinking and learning, and this is where we want to focus today, are in a sense for Heidegger a way of being in the world. There's another German word, the verb, which is important. It doesn't translate well as well, which is besorgen, which is the notion of caring. Caring's an odd, not quite the right word in English. It sounds a bit sort of namby-pamby. But being in the world is also caring about the world, being engaged with the world, unfolding your potentialities within the world. So I think there's something very, very deep about this concept of Dasein, which was new and still is quite fresh in my own mind, certainly. But in teaching and learning, it was about having a deep interest. You have to be interested to learn something. You only really learn if you care about something. Care not being the right word, but engaged with things.
Yes, and this is echoing another great mind here, Nick Shackleton-Jones. Says you can't learn anything you don't care about it.
Oh yeah, and so I've talked to Nick about this. Nick absolutely draws from Heidegger and his theories in this, and more power to his elbow. Nick's a big fan of Heidegger, as I am, and there's, as we'll see, well, if we can unpack this a wee bit more, you'll see how it becomes so interesting. So to expand on the Dasein concept, there are other. Let's not go into the German words too much, but there's this notion of being thrown forward in life. Unpacking your potentialities, and learners and teachers, he talks a lot about teachers, must be seen as being part and being engaged with the world, not as subjects or people who have to learn and teachers who have to give them that knowledge. He thinks that's completely wrong because both exist in a moving, thrown attitude towards life. So, he's dead against that notion that although he did it himself, like a lot of academics, they don't practice what we preach. He still lectured and almost boringly, but nevertheless, on teaching and learning, there's another essay which is written much, much later called "What is Thinking," 1954. This is the really interesting nitty-gritty one around teaching and learning because he illustrates it by example. Now, he thinks that learning should be about authentic thinking in the world, Dasein, being in the world. To teach or learn is to avoid all the superficialities which you often get when you're in a school or listening to people teach. And he takes the example of a cabinet maker, like an apprentice who's in the room making this beautiful cabinet. And he talks about how the apprentice has to learn not just to use the hammer and the chisel and the plane, but he has to find the essence of the process in the feel of the wood. It's beautifully written, this passage, but I think he's right. You have to feel the essence. You have to care about the deeper being of that act in the world with making that object for this purpose. And now with that insight, I will quote from the passage, but it is brilliant. He reflects on the relationship then between the teacher and the learner, and learning, of course, the third thing. And it's such an intense passage, but he also says something interesting, that teaching is actually quite harder than learning because you have to the learner is in the world doing things, totally engaged with making the cabinet. The master or teacher, as it were, is sort of a wee bit outside that, not wholly in the flow of being. But that doesn't mean to say the teacher should be the presenter of knowledge from a PowerPoint, which would be a waste, or overly didactic or a pedagogue of some type, but must be encouraging and creating the conditions for the learner to learn. It's quite deep stuff, this, but I think he's fundamentally right. That learning is obviously more than just the accumulation of knowledge, skills, and so on. But I think it's this notion of the learner having to have their being in the act of learning itself, much deeper engagement. Now, he has another concept of learning here, which is an unveiling. You're uncovering the sense of being and engagement with the world because you've got direct interaction with it. You're in it, doing it, and in a genuine, authentic, and immersive fashion. And he describes teaching as Leiten, which is that's not instruction, but it's almost guiding or facilitating the learner, the sort of language we've heard often. So I think there's an interesting follow-through from this, in that some of the things we see emerging in AI, for example, in dialogue-based tutors and so on, may very well, if they get more sophisticated, have something to learn from Heidegger here about encouraging the learner, the agent. AI is essentially throwing power back into the agent. You're the person leading the dialogue, but the guidance is coming from the chatbot as well. And that may very well, we may have a lot to learn from Heidegger about the authenticity of that dialogue and that learning experience.
And he's influential on all the other theorists here. Yeah. They all kick off from Heidegger.
In different sort of ways, really. It's probably better I'll touch on that when we discuss each of them, but I think just to finish off on Heidegger, actually, I almost forgot that. There's one big area where he's most often quoted these days, actually, in terms of learning, and that is his attitude towards technology. So, so in his later life, remember, he's fundamentally an anti-modernist. And therefore, the undercurrent here is anti-technology. He's in that sort of German late romantic tradition of, well, almost like, the same was true of England with the Romantic movement in literature and poetry, almost against technology, but in a subtle sort of way, because he has a really interesting description of technology as something called a standing reserve. Now, we take this technology, and he loved the example of electricity. So electricity is something that's out there, behind our wall, behind the switch. It's there, something we call upon. And he sees technology as dehumanizing us, pushing us towards inauthentic behavior and existence, because it's got this standing reserve or separate from us, and we pull it and call upon it as a resource. He thinks the great danger here is that we start treating human beings as resources like technology. We put them on a par. And there's something about human resources. He was ahead of the game there, perhaps. But, we become too easily addicted to the easy availability and readiness of technology. And he thinks there's a German word, but the English word is inframing of technology as a standing reserve or something we call upon. He says that's a way of just putting it in a pot ready for consumption, and which he didn't like at all. He thought that was inauthentic. But we've got to be careful here, because actually, if you read it in detail, and so that one essay, What's Technology, and others, he avoids any really trite sort of dismissal and negativity and stupid binary ethical views of technology. It's really a way of him talking about authenticity, or trying to maintain authenticity as an individual in the world, and that I quite admire. Just touch it. So as we move into the other thinkers here, you asked about his influence, and he certainly, he had a massive influence along with Nietzsche on the post-structuralists, such as obviously Foucault, Derrida, and Lyotard. But in a way, they in a sense, I don't think, did latch on to the authenticity side of Heidegger. I think they took his destruction of the subject, object, act, and content, and took his concept of Dasein, but didn't do anything with it, really. They just took the destructive force in Heidegger and caricatured and expanded upon that. I think Heidegger was the only real philosopher of the group, by the way. The rest are really, I think, more cultural theorists, more engaged with literary and linguistic criticism. I think the real philosopher here is Heidegger, but he was, in a sense, taken superficially by the others.
Okay, so it's all his fault.
Yes, we can say that, yeah.
Okay, let's move on now to the and see what ruins he has wrought in the minds of the people who followed him. Paul-Michel Foucault, 1926 to 1984. Born in Poitiers, France, Paul-Michel Foucault grew up in a middle-class family. His father was a prominent surgeon. He studied at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris and later taught at various institutions, including the Collège de France. Renowned for his critical studies of social institutions, Foucault's works include Discipline and Punish and The History of Sexuality. Fun fact, Foucault was an avid fan of fencing and competed during his university years. Less fun fact, some have accused him of being a pedophile. Great deal of controversy about that. Nevertheless, he was a towering figure in critical theory. He had a strong interest in prisons, including a fascination with Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon, the prison where you can be surveilled at any point during the day, which kind of throws forwards to our own worries about surveillance culture and surveillance technology. He suggests that contemporary life is a process of serial incarceration. This is something I particularly found quite empathetic when I was young. You go to school, then you get a job, then or you're in the army, or you're in the prison, or in a care home. We're none of us as free as we think. When it comes to educational institutions in particular, which he sees as shaped by power dynamics and to be a kind of machine of control in a way, I get a bit of a Pink Floyd vibe about it all. Teachers leave those kids alone. But his assertion that what gets taught in schools usually has some ideological component would be hard to dismiss entirely, wouldn't it? I mean, isn't that true?
I think that's right. That's one of the more interesting aspects of his thought. I think it's about, as you were speaking there, I forgot about the paedophile thing, but you're right. That's like Heidegger and Nazism. This hangs over the modern Foucault a little bit, and Julie Bindel wrote a lot about this. It turns out some of it has been a bit exaggerated.
Yeah.
Seeing stories with young boys, for example, I don't know. I really don't know what the truth is there. But there was a very famous, Bindel wrote something that was wrong about the consent letter that he wrote, because Simone de Beauvoir had also signed that letter. That was more about consent for homosexuals as well, and parity. So
it's worth pointing out, and if anybody who wants to look into that the age of consent for heterosexual sex in France at that time was 15. And that he wanted parity with that. So it's easy to kind of misread that as being
that is correct, John. Yeah. And because there were lots of people signed that letter, in fact, at the time. But actually, the real thing centers around an example he gives in his written work of a young girl who an older man gets to commit a sexual act with, which we won't go into, but it's a sort of masturbation story. And that, to be honest, there seems to be a wee bit of substance in that one, to be honest, but not enough.
The problematical thing is that he basically says that a child can consent to sex with an adult, and that feels like a smoking gun for many.
Yeah, and in fact, he doesn't say that explicitly. He almost uses it as a thought experiment or a discussion point, rather than explicitly saying this ought to happen and be put into law or whatever. Yeah, but that's why it's more of a shadow, which we can sort of probably leave it there. But coming to Foucault himself, I mean, he's probably the most influential of this group. In the 1980s onwards, when we remember him hitting the streets, as it were, his ideas just absolutely soaked into everything. Certainly not the sciences. And even in philosophy, it was quite distant, because most British or Anglo-Saxon philosophy sort of studiously ignored him. But he was part of the structuralist gang of four, they used to call them, the Levi Strauss, Barthes, who's the other one, Lacan is the other one. So, and I think, when you read, I mean, these books are interesting, but still, less so than Heidegger, but still obtuse, difficult to read, really difficult terminology. Nevertheless, you have this huge figure that looms large over everything that came after him, certainly in France, and certainly in some areas of the humanities, especially literary criticism. But his philosophy itself is interesting. So he talks about the archaeology of culture. This is something he gets really from Nietzsche, and uncovers what he thinks are these power structures. He takes Marxism, really, and replaces the mechanics of economics with the word power, or French more accurately, these epistemes that dominate or define and control knowledge. And he thinks that's what higher education and schools and, by and large, institutional learning does. It sets the canon, it sets the tone, and controls students and how they think. In contrast to that, he introduces this notion of trying to smash these power structures. And there was a sort of cultural relativism emerges, from all this. And that we need to, and this is where all the decolonization stuff comes from. He thought that philosophy itself was in need of decolonization. And that we should take all this largely Eurocentric type knowledge and norms in philosophy from Plato onwards and literally bin them and bucket them. So you have this postmodern destruction of all these boundaries and distinctions, including the binaries. This is terribly important for him and Derrida, of course, and because certain forms of language themselves, language itself, has an epistemology which constructs and plays these power games, not only from the point of view of the individual, but also groups, and also in their translation into universal principles. So gender, race, other distinctions come to the fore because he sees the world in terms of power and oppression and the oppressed. Therefore, certain groups really love this stuff. You mentioned, so you had Madness and Civilization and Discipline and Punish.
Yeah.
This is in the 60s and 70s before he really becomes really big in the 1980s. But he also introduces, as in Discipline and Punish, the idea of sort of teaching and training. So he comes back to this notion that the whole world is skewed towards institutionalization of learning, the sort of monastic enclosures, these panopticons, where the architecture of the school, even, you're marched up and down lines, and God, that's come back in, the sort of Michela model of obviously, and you put them in these little military uniforms. The architecture of the school itself, he thought, was like a prison. This massive amount of supervision, the control through the timetable, restrictions of movement behavior. And he described the building, that is nice, the buildings themselves are pedagogical machines. That's what they reduce the individual to. And that was his analogy with the prison idea, really. And then finally, of course, you have bells ringing and all sorts of things, but you have the examinations that sort of, like the full stop at the end of the sentence, they bring this form of supervision to a head. And what you do is you'll label everybody and you give them a grade and a number before they leave, almost like a tattoo on their wrist, and say, this is where you're going to go in society. Now, he has a point here, a serious point about the mechanisms of social control of power.
But is he slightly kind of harking back to, well, not harking back, but do you kind of feel the ghost of Rousseau here?
Oh, yeah.
And it makes me think of Wordsworth, shades of the prison house close upon the growing boy. And this sense of, we come trailing clouds of glory, and we're kind of confined and shut down in these human institutions and so on. Does that come out of, the Enlightenment that we figure like Rousseau that we covered earlier?
Oh, well spotted. This is right out of Rousseau and Marx, of course, for Foucault. This notion of the disciplined and docile, suppression of thought and knowledge that had to be released. This is exactly what Rousseau wrote about in Emile. Not quite as the way people thought if you read the book, but that relentless administration of exams, surveillance, hierarchical observation, all that sort of stuff. That's right out the Rousseauan playbook, as it were. So in the archaeology of knowledge and the genealogy of education, these two big concepts, he goes much further and calls this is like the regimentation of truth, the regimes of truth, he called them. And they legitimize all this knowledge. They saying this is the way in which this canon will be imposed upon people. Okay, so it's the societal norms that we put into students that really come to play here. Knowledge is power. The nexus of power is through the institutions and structures, the schools and universities. And Foucault thought that that's where power really did operate. Unwittingly for most people. He said they give the illusion of critical thinking and open thought, but not really, which is why he is really seen as one of the leading lights in this notion of critical pedagogy, which I think goes way, way too far. But he's seen as a critical theorist, of course.
Yeah.
One of the big
kind of violent, transgressive figure, and
yes,
he falls alongside those people like like William Burroughs that
Yeah.
have this kind of dark, almost malevolent energy to them that's very attractive to young people. I'm kind of harking back to my years as a punk rocker, and Foucault was our man.
Yes.
And and if you look at the way he kind of some of his actions during the événement of '68 in Paris, he was chucking rocks at people and the rest of it. So
That's right.
this is a rock star philosopher, but is it completely negative? This energy of his, it's destructive. He wants to kind of tear stuff down.
Yeah.
Does he just want to tear it all down?
Well, that's one of the problems with Foucault is there's lots of tearing down, but not much building or solutions to these problems other than let's be hypercritical. I mean, I think there's something about him being very fashionable. If you even in his books, the history of sexuality. Suddenly you got titles like Discipline and Punish, The Archaeology of Knowledge, Madness and Civilization, The History of Sexuality in two volumes. In fact, there were three or four volumes in the end, right through. The last one was called I remember that one, The Confessions of the Flesh. Like he was pandering to an audience here to a degree, which I don't really like in philosophy, but he was pandering to a different sort of audience, which is the arrogance of youth. I would say, no, it's no exaggeration. It's the only people who read him were students in universities, really.
Well, I don't know it's much the arrogance, because those people join the Young Conservatives. Isn't it more the rebelliousness of youth? I mean, it's like what are you rebelling against? What do you got kind of attitude.
Well, as we said with Heidegger, you're playing with fire in this one, the rebelliousness of youth. If you just latch onto that, see it as a universally good thing, because they were burning books by Jewish authors just decades before this. He swings the other way and said, well, let's be iconoclastic against traditional philosophical thought. Let's burn Plato. Well, really, because I think we're now living with this is why I think Foucault became quite dangerous, no fault of his own, perhaps, but he dies in quite early 1980s, can't remember, somewhere in the mid-80s anyway. So he pops his clogs, but since then, his influence then was, I think, insidious in the university system. You had what some people don't kill me for this, but what people jokingly call the grievance studies suddenly emerged. There was, I think, quite interesting forms of feminism and gender studies then, but it then becomes there are people like Angela Harris in critical race theory, draws on Foucault. Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality fame, draws on Foucault. They all draw on. In fact, those two, to be fair, actually, those two are not Foucault fans. They rejected Foucault and Derrida, but the rest, people like Butler, for example, in queer theory, post-colonial people, Spivak, even the fat studies people like Linda Bacon, Foucault appears on every second page. So I think it had an insidious effect on identity politics, which, boy, is that alive and kicking. It's a feature of almost every election we look at. Just brought down the Scottish government, So I think, funnily enough, this is what we discussed at the beginning. The roots of Foucault grew into non-Foucaultian language of the oppressed and oppressor being oppressed, that binary language, seeing the world in terms of power. The poor no longer had a role to play. The Marxist concern with people who were poor and maybe had to be given a voice and helped in the world. It was now about specific groups within the world. And I think that's a shame, really, that we've abandoned the poor for the identities very often of middle-class people, as opposed to the people who are really suffering. But that's going in that political direction. That's why I'm not a big fan of Foucault.
Is there a kind of wider problem in a way in a lot of the stuff that we're looking at, is that you can have ideas that are kind of dangerous, difficult to contain, and they work within the sphere of sort of politics and culture and so on. When you bring it to learning, you need institutions to be able to have learning, don't you? You need a certain amount of discipline, because we know how the brain works. It needs to be kind of regularized and systematized. And some of these ideas that float around in the world, sorry, I'm finding it difficult to put this into words, but because it's only just popped into my head. But it is always going to be a problem with our Great Minds on Learning project, that this is all about kind of trainers and teachers, and they want to do the right thing and they want to be good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Well, the problem there, though, I think that's right. But here's the rub. They don't become open and part of critical pedagogy. They become fossilized. They become built into the courses. And we have a whole number of academics and journals and critical pedagogy journals which simply recycle. In fact, they're very often ridiculed by these false papers that people send in and get published just because they use the vocabulary of the orthodoxy. And that's the danger here, that this is what Foucault was hoisted by his own petard. On the one hand, he's saying the universities and so on are the people who impose this awful notion of ideological theory on people. Then his ideology becomes part of the university institutional system and imposes it on young people, and that goes on and on and on in a vicious cycle, so that nobody moves on. So I think, in a sense, he hung by his own noose on this one, because it's now still with us. In fact, probably stronger than ever before, because many of these departments, I feel, have been captured by this stuff, imprisoned by it in a way that Foucault almost warned us of this, but he became the progenitor of the model he attacked.
Okay. And I think we have to move on as well. To another theorist whose name, completely irrelevant, he just makes me think of Jane Fonda and workout videos. Jean-François Lyotard, 1924 to 1998. That's Lyotard, not Leotard. Jean-François Lyotard was born in Versailles, France, and grew up in a modest family. He studied philosophy at the Sorbonne in Paris. He taught at several universities, including the University of Paris 8. And Paris 8 was founded in the days following the events of '68 in Paris, which were absolutely tumultuous and has a very interesting history, which we don't really have time to go into now, but it's worth looking up. And this is where we find Foucault pelting the police with rocks and so on, and Lacan's daughter going around, who had some kind of responsibility for certification of academic results, going around handing these certificates out to people in the street and on the subway and so on, because she said she didn't believe in the institution and she didn't want it to work properly. Bliss was it in that hour to be alive. Sorry, back to Lyotard. Best known for the postmodern condition, he explored the impact of postmodernity on knowledge and society. Fun fact, Lyotard initially aspired to be a painter before turning to philosophy. So a bit of an arty influence there. Postmodernism has been huge in the arts. I could go on about it for a long time, and I think it kind of means slightly different things there. But how does it play out in the field of learning?
Yeah, so a lot of people don't realize that when you use the word postmodern, this was the guy who coined the term.
Yeah, he owns it.
Yeah, so the postmodern tradition, which was written in 1979, really sets the pace for all this. But I think he's interesting also because he went to the States, the University of California, then Emory, so he also had this Anglo-Saxon side to him that I don't think you find really you certainly don't find in Heidegger or Foucault or Derrida, who we're going to discuss next. But I think that's right. He's perhaps the most relevant out of this group in terms of teaching and learning, and had a very clear view of it, which I quite like, in fact. But first of all, philosophically, the idea of postmodernism for him was the destruction of these meta-narratives. And we've had whole podcasts on this, whether it's psychoanalysis or Marxism or utilitarianism or whatever, he thought that these were superstructures and ideological, and that we needed to bring ourselves back to the real world in the way that Heidegger suggests almost. He was massively influenced by Heidegger as well. Back to these personal, what you call mini narratives. They sort of reduce knowledge back to your own lived experience. And this is where it gets a bit odd, because it's also reductionist in that sense. So you have these, he puts the mini narratives of individuals and groups above any meta narratives. And where he goes badly wrong, I think, is in his rather trite attacks on science. And some other general theory as well, but he's quite dismissive of science. So you've got this epistemic relativism. everything comes back down to you and your lived experience. That's far more important than empirical evidence about the world. And we hear young people parrot that quite a lot, I think, even today. So, you're talking about, a theory that what is 55 years old, but people are still using the same words and language that he wrote about. Now, in the postmodern condition, that's in the late 70s, 79, the subtitle of that book's a report on knowledge. So he's very focused on this. The idea how you get rid of these meta-narratives, but you get this other thing that he recommends that comes in with diverse perspectives. He thought diversity was a terribly important thing. He didn't mean diversity of people, by the way. He thought that he's talking about diversity of thought.
Yeah.
So his educational approach is founded on these mini narratives, diversity of thought, that values adaptability and critical engagement, the critical pedagogy side of this. He wanted a more flexible, pragmatic, and also, interestingly, he really was a fan of technology being integrated into learning, because that was part of the real world. And to ignore it, like to ignore AI, now that nearly 3/4 of the world are using it, would seem trite to him and ridiculous, because education is about engaging with the real world, not holding it at bay and living in this world of abstract academic meta-narratives and ideology. So for Lyotard, knowledge is about, not the objectivity and truth and absolutes and ideology and so on. It's about it's really about being opposed to that fixity or the canon, which we would normally get or used to get, certainly in university, is replaced by new canons, I think. And this is where he comes in with a very interesting concept that I quite like, called parology. Parology is this generation of the new contradictory perspectives. The rough and tumble of social media is almost paralogical for me. In other words, it's a pluralistic, multi-perspectival view of learning. This localized, context-specific narratives, as opposed to these bold, universal claims. Now, where he goes wrong is in his criticism of science, because he sort of caricatures science as being ideological and going for the truth or stating the truth. Of course, the very opposite is true of the scientific method. It's always a state of knowledge ready to be falsifiable, or whatever theory of science you believe in. But it's certainly a rolling stone, as it were. And that's where I think he goes badly wrong, because it's highly critical science. It's a critical activity. Now, he actually calls for reform here and believes that I think he wanted what he called performative knowledge. And what he meant by that was more vocational learning, really, to get rid of the old narratives and these universal truths and all this abstract teaching of courses at university, and get back to sort of measurable outcomes and skills. He wrote quite a lot about this. I think the most postmodernisms, people were all sort of, heads in the air, ivory tower type people. But he really did believe in the prioritization of skills and knowledge that have sort of clear and immediate applications in the world over all this abstract theorizing, which he thought had gone badly wrong. And as I say,
does that take us back to Heidegger and his sort of obsession with woodwork and DIY?
Well spotted. That's exactly where it comes from. And this is why, all these theories, that from Heidegger and also this from Lyotard, I find extremely, just very, very interesting. And it is completely ignored by people who latch onto these theories, that the guy who invented the term postmodernism actually didn't believe in the sort of things that most of the modern departments in humanities teach. It's a rather peculiar turn, really. They use them, but he would, if these people were around now, they'd be abusing these academic departments of being completely and utterly out of touch. Now, going back to the Heidegger thing, he has a very interesting text called Inhuman, which was written in the late 80s, where, again, this is a bit, he said, don't have all your faith in science, but he does legitimize the digital capture of knowledge and this whole notion of having some faith in technology. So he's the only person who really goes into this in detail, but he embraces technology. But as I say, his attack on science as a meta-narrative doesn't really hold water for me, because science is not like that. You can't delegitimize science on that basis, because it has a nice defense mechanism, which is, no, it moves forward and criticizes its own theories. It's highly critical in itself. So, but Postmodern doesn't have a monopoly on emancipation here. It's not as if postmodernism is the be end and all of all this. There were lots of people around in the 60s and 70s before postmodernism who thought like this. It wasn't exactly fresh thinking. I think it has its roots in the 1960s, really. Nevertheless, we have to be we have to be careful here. I think with all these theorists, there's one other thing that bugs me a little bit. They say that it delegitimizes democracy. In other words, well, it's all very well you having all these theories about education, teaching, and learning, but actually we have democracies where parents and real people in the real world say, no, actually we quite like school. We quite like our kids learning to read and write and have some basic skills in the world. And so these people come along with a critical pedagogy and say, no, we know better than you. This is what your kids need. Don't be stupid. Boy, do I think that view of the world has risen. You see it on social media quite a lot. There's dismissal of sometimes socially conservative ideas. Parents, when I was a governor of a comprehensive school here in Brighton, parents were remarkably conservative about what they wanted for their kids across all social classes. And therefore, the danger here is that the critical pedagogy stuff is really an imposition by a tiny number, by the few and the many, and ignores democracy and what people actually vote for in educational policies. So that's the danger here.
Yeah. Part of the kind of cultural resonances of postmodernism have been a word that comes up again and again. And, looking at popular culture, things like The Simpsons and so on, it is this term meta. Yeah. And the idea of postmodernism is kind of about television programs about television programs, books about books, Umberto Eco, books speak of other books. Yeah, right. And that it's kind of infinitely recursive in a way, because if you don't have a kind of overarching meta narrative to believe in, then everything is just kind of free play of signs. Yeah. It's free play of everybody's narrative. Nobody's narrative means anything more than anybody else's. Relativism is the big charge against all this. Does this come into his view of learning in a destructive way, do you think? Or
no, because I think he goes in the opposite direction. He thinks it should be grounded in reality, hence his shift back to real knowledge and skills that have an applicable output in the real world. But that was beautifully expressed there, because I think it actually leads beautifully into our next thinker, and that's Derrida, because Derrida does exactly what you really nicely surfaced there, John, which was, that cycle, that recursive cycle, is what Derrida actually did and promoted. So let's move on to him, I think.
So let's plunge forward into this hole of mirrors. Yes. I know we're heading towards here. And bring us back again to the intro, in a way. So Jacques Derrida, 1930 to 2004. Jacques Derrida was born in El Biar, Algeria, to a Sephardic Jewish family. He grew up in a multicultural environment and later moved to France, studying at the École Normale Supérieure. Derrida taught at various institutions, including Yale University and the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. A pioneer of deconstruction, his works included Of Grammatology. Fun fact, Derrida was passionate about soccer and played as a goalkeeper in his youth. And that's interesting, because the writer Camus was also a goalkeeper, and I think played for the Algerian national team, if I'm right. And Derrida was from Algeria as well. And there's a word for that. I think that kind of colonial inheritance, is it pied noir, or not quite sure. Derrida is notoriously difficult to read, as I found out to my cost when I picked him up in the 80s, and seems to be a bit slippery in the way he leans on puns, imagery, and double meanings in his work. But the difficulty can perhaps be justified by his own apparent sense of the impossibility of what he's trying to do, writing about writing from within writing. Not to let him off the hook, but with all that wordplay and meta this and meta that, how are we to teach, train, and learn in Derrida's deconstructed relativistic universe? Discuss.
I love how you introduced these little biographical sort of notions at the beginning. And you're right, he was a goalkeeper in Algeria. That's Derrida, as was Camus, of course. Although Camus is interesting because I only know this, John, because God, you bring back memories here. When I was a student, I wrote for a fanzine, a football fanzine called Sick as a Parrot in Scotland, and I wrote a big article. It was at on Camus at the time and how he was a goalkeeper, but he actually used his football experience and wrote about it, about how it had taught him all about human solidarity and ethics and the physicality of existence and all that sort of stuff. He's really interesting, but I can't recall a single word about football from Derrida, and I read a lot of Derrida when I was a student. But I remember I also wrote a separate thing on that famous Monty Python sketch with all the footballers. I don't know if you ever watched that, which is absolute work of genius, I think.
And the footballers or the philosophers?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
René Descartes was a drunken fart. I drink, therefore I am. Aristotle was the bugger for the bottle. Yeah.
Well, because the referee was Confucius, which I quite liked.
Oh.
And the manager was Martin Luther. But actually, Heidegger was on the team. Heidegger sort of wandered about just reflecting on the notion of being while people just drove the ball straight past them, of course. But it was absolutely brilliant because I don't know if you remember, it was actually Germany versus the Greeks. So you had Leibniz, Kant, and famously George Nobby Hegel, along with people like Wittgenstein, Friedrich Nietzsche. But Heidegger was a midfield player. They had Karl Marx as their substitute in the German team. But the Greeks won in a late goal by Socrates, and they won 1-0. Anyway, that all came flooding back. Anyway, on to Derrida himself. And I think you're right. So he has this incredibly productive period. Remember, he goes much further back into the 1960s, 67, of grammatology, writing and difference, speech and phenomena. These books are notoriously difficult to read, but deliberately so. Let's not imagine that he was writing to be read. But I think we have to go back before sort of unpacking some of the more obtuse language he uses. We have to understand what his game was here, in the football analogy, perhaps. But the metaphysics of presence was his target here. And this, again, the postmodernists and all the people we've been speaking of have previous philosophical metaphysical theories as their target. This notion of a fixed, unchanging foundation to everything, these absolute truths that were expressed in philosophical systems. This was his target as it was for the others, okay? And that helps explain his whole attitude towards the text, okay? Because behind this, he saw Western thought, all of this stuff from Plato onwards, including the pre-Socratics to a degree, although some of them call upon the pre-Socratics as a more enlightened age. And this goes back to the podcast we had on orality versus text. With the Greeks, you have... I think he got this all wrong. I think he got it completely and utterly wrong. He thought that we had prioritized speech over writing in Western philosophy. And that was the assumption that speech was more immediate, reliable, and genuine, and more authentic, okay? And what he wanted to do was focus more on the texts. So he was dead against the phonocentrism, namely what he called speech, in favor of the complete elevation and putting on a pedestal of the written word. And so the text was everything for Derrida. And of course, in grammatology, the book, it has this famous phrase, there is nothing outside of the text. Now, that you've got to be very careful with that sentence, because it doesn't mean there is nothing just other than the words. It seems ridiculous, that phrase or that sentence, and people say, well, the Holocaust is not a text. It did actually happen, But what he meant was the text is entangled in the world, okay? So you have textuality and context. So he argues that every aspect of our understanding and experience is mediated through language and text. He's wrong here, because there are people who can't read who still have experience in the world. But he thought there was no such thing as a direct, unmediated access to reality. As soon as we reflect upon it, language comes into play. But Wittgenstein here, really, language being the limits of our thought. So that's what that meant. And this leads to his really deep critique of fixed meanings, which is quite interesting. He says that, words don't have a stable inherent meaning in themselves, like as in a dictionary, which is what Wittgenstein believed in. Instead, he thought the meaning was generated through relationships between words and their differences from each other, which is how large language models work, interestingly. But let's not dive into that one. It would be a bit tangential. But the relational nature of language implies that meaning is always deferred. It's never fully present or complete, if you see what I mean. It's always leading to this concept of différence, A with an acute. Différence is not difference. And this ongoing unfolding of meaning is in the very nature of the use of language. And then he talks about intertextuality, the deconstruction of hierarchies. So that's what he meant by there's nothing outside of the text. It's that it highlights the central role of language in shaping our understanding of reality, but it's fluid and indeterminate, a bit like a large language model. And you have to get really to the heart of what he meant by all that. And that's what all his deconstruction, his other big concept, was this critical approach to just uncover archaeologically the assumptions and oppositions. He hated these binary oppositions. On this point, I think he's absolutely spot on. To give an example, the one that's often quoted is, the word presence brings in the word absence at the same time. In other words, these oppositions are often unitary things. They're not binary oppositions at all. In fact, there's a whole science around this, the notion of antinomy or opposites that he deconstructs. And he thought that deconstruction was about critical engagement and dialogue and questioning of the assumptions of language to reveal all these hidden assumptions and contradictions.
Is there a kind of lineage to Nietzsche with that, who of course was a philologist, and he bases his kind of critique in the genealogy of morality, I think, around the meanings of certain words and how language shapes thought. It sounds like it's very close to that here.
Oh, in fact, right out Nietzsche. Well, he wrote a book called Spurs on Nietzsche itself, which I've got right behind me on the shelf here now. The link with Nietzsche is interesting. Though Nietzsche also has this deep critique of binary oppositions. And so the famous book, his most famous book perhaps, Beyond Good and Evil, Beyond Good and Evil, beyond the binary opposition of good and evil. And so Nietzsche, Derrida talks about this all the time. In fact, we talked about, this is what my conversation with Derrida was way back in the day in Edinburgh. It was about that Nietzschean critique. Nietzsche also thought it was a sort of linguistic promiscuity. Derrida didn't really think that. He thought it was just part of the normal way in which language worked. But for Derrida, everything is contested, and this does come out the Nietzschean perspectival view of the world as well. So, but he had Derrida had his very almost idiosyncratic view of this through intertextuality, the idea that texts refer to and are shaped by other texts. So you create this web of meaning in the world. Everything's interconnected and interdependent. So a novel can reference other quotes or literary works. And, the script of a movie often will have references to previous movies. But he was big on this deconstruction of binary oppositions, male, female, light, dark, good and evil, there's this interesting concept that I quite liked of a trace, the notion that every element of language and meaning leaves a trace on other elements which contribute to meaning. This actually corresponds quite nicely to the concept of a weight in a large language model. In other words, the words are not individually separate. They have a statistical relationship with other closely related words in a giant nexus of meaning. And then a couple of other concepts that, if you really want to know Derrida well, you have to understand his notion of aporia. And that's, at the end of this, you often have this state of complete puzzlement. A couple of times in this podcast, you've expressed it quite nicely. You're going, I'm stuck here. What does this mean? I feel, I'm bouncing off this wall. You reach this state of complete doubt, puzzlement. And he said that's a moment when contradictory meanings actually coexist, but you can't resolve them.
Yeah. Is that a bit similar to a thing that kind of happens in Plato, I think, and Socrates, that you get these dialogues that just seem to kind of drive into a morass and don't get anywhere. But the idea is that is the real state of thinking and philosophy, and what it's all about is that kind of slight puzzlement when you've brought into all the oppositions and contradictory ideas into presence, and they're all held there in opposition, and some of that state of confusion is admirable. I don't know.
He does have an escape hatch, though, Derrida, for this, which is a notion of supplement, or supplément, no doubt, in French.
Yeah.
That adds up. I said I wouldn't become one of those people and just became one. But
Yeah.
I mean, what that means is that things come along and supplement or replace and displace previous things. And he uses this to show that what is often secondary in a text or discussion becomes primary. So it's that old Hegelian idea, really.
Yeah.
But it's not as if he sees language as a complete and utter trap. He thinks we're sort of swimming freely within this nexus of language, and that there are ways in which new stuff can replace the old. We have to just swim with it, as it were. But at the end of the day, you know, what was it? It was that swimming was a lot of double entendres, puns. He loved talking about sex and death. It's one of the problems I have with these French philosophers playing to the gallery, you know, and it becomes a bit odd. And at the end of the day, I'm with, having read a lot of Derrida and gone through that whole period in my life, I really came to the same conclusion as Habermas and Searle, who were the two critics who described them as lacking clarity and precision in argument. And I think that's fundamentally correct. Jean Searle just accused them of bad writing. I mean, there's some truth in that as well, to be honest. But Habermas said, listen, this guy's just a complete relativist, lacks commitment to any rational discourse. Why should I engage? And he has a point, because just restricting everything to textual analysis becomes, it's a fool's gold, really.
Yeah. So that you've given a really good explanation of Derrida, I think, and I understand more about him than I did before. Certainly more than from reading him. But it's interesting to me that when I first kind of picked his stuff up in the 80s, encouraged no doubt by Scritti Politti, I had this experience of reading this stuff and thinking, I can't understand this. This is incomprehensible. But then having a kind of flash of inspiration that there was an idea that I think he was saying, I thought was really interesting and quite brilliant. But I didn't persist with it. When I picked him up just a couple of days ago, and tried to read Writing and Difference again, or some of it, I had exactly the same experience. So I don't understand it any more than I ever did. But there is a kind of intuition that he's saying something there that is really interesting.
I think that's right. This is the effect that I think they worked upon. It was a sort of a form of pomposity, really, you know, in making things sound profound when perhaps they weren't. And
so you're just saying it's a contrick, basically. It's not,
well, I think some of
he's saying stuff that is just very difficult to say and can't be said because he's writing about writing within writing.
Not entirely. I think there are insights there, certainly, and no doubt about that. But I think if you look at the shadow stuff, so there's another tradition in philosophy, namely Wittgenstein, which comes out of Germany, really. It is far more interesting in my book. I mean, Derrida's influence in the world has been almost nil. Wittgenstein remains.
Well, apart from some pop records, you know.
Yes, indeed, exactly. But I think that the reputation lives on, this sort of self-referential, you know, profundity. But it's a false. Postmodernism was a sort of false profundity. There are some real people in linguistics and other areas, psychology, and you know, who were applying and testing this. This is why the dismissal of science I don't like at all. I think that was a false dawn. And this is why it's so easy to spoof papers that mimic these people, because they're just packed full of vagueness and verbosity. So it's so really easy to sneak a paper and just using those words that gets published in the journals. That says something about how odd this all is. And yet it's still running. You know, these are still the big thinkers in some departments, because, you know, real science is quite hard. Reading about Derrida and using some fancy new language is actually quite easy in many ways.
Before we move on to, we're kind of moving towards summing up. Just put a cap on Derrida. It might be he tells us something useful or interesting about, even if heavily disguised, about knowledge, but probably not about practice, about how you would go about learning something. That wouldn't be something you could get from Derrida.
Well, I think we touched upon it there. I think what I like about Derrida is that notion of the fluidity of meaning, the relationship of words to other words, his work on binary oppositions. I think there's some really interesting stuff that I personally drew upon there and stuff I wrote about. But I think by and large, that's not the stuff interesting that gets used very often.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
but I think in many ways Derrida is this sort of cul-de-sac on the end of all this. He eventually just says, I'm sitting here with a bunch of books doing endless iterations on what I think are their meaning and the playfulness of words. I think that is a cul-de-sac because they all rejected science in one form or another, and therefore there's no way out of the cul-de-sac. That's the problem.
Okay. So it's all Heidegger's fault where it ends up isn't quite as cogent as where it begins. Let's move to summing up now. So summing up, it's easy to see that this group of thinkers has had a significant impact on higher education as well as society in general, politics and so on, because that influence is still controversial and people are still arguing about it and shouting about how terrible they are on social media. So obviously they mean something. However, what can we say more generally about how they've changed our ideas on learning?
Well, in a sense, it's not so much they changed the ideas of someone learning. So they stimulated the critical pedagogy movement. And some of those people would perhaps I think we'll probably do another podcast on those people, Giroux, and there are a whole number of theorists who are active in academia, especially in this one. But even, I remember getting an email from somebody who wanted to talk to me in a further education college, and she was the head of nursing, who were teaching Heidegger, and I thought, this is absurd. When I was doing a philosophy course, I wasn't doing a course on nursing. Why on earth would you introduce Heidegger to that process? And so I think some of this infection is bad. But just to sum up, when this abstract theory becomes so abstract and it completely sort of detaches itself from the real world, and learning is a real world phenomenon, then we're in trouble. So Heidegger, for example, strives forward, and you get this unfolding. This led him to throw himself with zeal into the Nazi cause, implementing the policies and literally sacking Jewish academics and being anti-Semitic towards Jewish students. In France, Foucault's infatuation with Marx and the oppressed and oppression has led to some insidious things in our universities, I think that have not been positive, leading to the increasing irrelevance or a crisis of relevance in universities. Great deal of suspicion about whether this theorizing in these courses have imprisoned or trapped people in ideology as opposed to freeing them from it. Derrida is probably the best example, putting text on a pedestal at the expense of everything else. Lyotard is a notable exception because I think he escaped from that trap. Nevertheless, the notion that everything comes down to personal lived experience is still a bit of a relativistic swamp. But, there is this feeling that a lot of it has ended up as a lot of academic hot air. And that, what Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay called not critical theories, but cynical theories, which is a phrase I quite liked. And so the roots of and here we have to be, the political. Even when I'm saying this, I'm going, am I allowed to say this now? Even that's how bad and ideological it has become. But critical race theory, which is largely a US phenomenon, comes out of Derek Bell, Mackintosh's white privilege. All of this deeply rooted in Foucault. Judith Butler's queer theory. Deeply, she quotes them all the time. Incomprehensibly relativistic form of performative social constructivism on steroids. Crenshaw's intersectionality, perhaps the most banal and metaphorical of the theories. The fat studies of Linda Bacon. It goes way, way out of control, this stuff, I think, not grounded in reality in the way that these philosophers pushed us into de-anchoring ourselves from reality. Now, I do have some sympathy with some of the post-colonial theorists like Fanon and Said and so on, and they were obsessed by Foucault, but I don't think that gets as lost as the other people. And I think in many ways, feminism has founded on that rock as well. What used to be women's studies shifted to gender studies, and then the slicing and dicing of sexuality and blah, blah, blah. And then it not only de-anchors from the real world, it de-anchors itself from biology, which is where, and that's alive and kicking as a political issue right now, whatever side of the fence you sit on, or whether you're in the middle or somewhere. It's led to a great deal of angst in the system. Disillusionment with higher education, I think, is one of the results of this. And So, these podcasts are interesting because we shouldn't be falling into the trap and thinking that all these theorists are good and positive and constructive. Some of them may have led to very destructive behaviors, theories, and implementations in education.
You could take a kind of Hegelian view of that and say that, the kind of onslaught of people like Foucault was a movement in a certain direction, and then you get a movement back, and perhaps you end up somewhere on the road to enlightenment through the play of these binaries, potentially. One other thing that occurs to me while you're talking here is I think I kind of get why this group of people have been so influential in the arts, and especially in literature. I mean, postmodernism huge in late 20th century literature, and it's kind of that thing of the relativism, which, as you say, gets out of control.
That's right.
If you're a creative artist, say you're an actor, you want to inhabit another human being, you have to completely immerse yourself in that point of view. If you're a novelist, you have to have character A who completely disagrees with character B, and you have to give all of them absolute prime time focus. This is the genius of Shakespeare, that we have Iago and we have Othello and we have Desdemona, and we're in all of their heads. And there is a kind of bad to use uber words when you're talking about Heidegger, but there is a kind of uber relativism about the whole idea of literature, art, even music to a degree, and in many fields. So I can see why, my generation particularly was so kind of captivated by these people. I suppose you could also say, if you wanted to be positive about it, that this relativism has given us an appreciation of the views of other people and of our own inability to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, and unless we make really, strenuous efforts to do it, that in some senses have brought about, greater equity in government and organizations. But as you say, isn't it? It's kind of it's a balance, moderation in all things, including moderation. It gets out of hand. Is that the problem?
Well, except the poor, John. You notice your analysis there and stepping in other people's shoes, excluding them, which is what Marx wrote about. And so when we become obsessed by the walking, but only in the shoes of other people whose groups we approve of, that's the danger. You mentioned Hegel. The consequence of Hegel...
Well, I don't think that is what I mean, because I think it means, being Shakespeare means looking at stepping into the shoes of the person that you don't agree with, dislike, who hates, and who's hated and outcast and othered by everybody else.
Well, I would agree with the Shakespearean thing, but Shakespeare is, isn't the prime mover in politics. Identity politics is pure politics. And there, I think the danger with this, well, to take one, so to deal with the Hegelian part, Hegelian ends with Pol Pot, with slicing and dicing and down to identities, and you kill off the other people because you don't like them. So that's a strict binary.
I realised that was not necessarily a good path to go down.
Yeah. But to come back to the theories we've been discussing in postmodernism, I think the danger there is that swamp of relativism where, well, what do? We just regard as everybody is different, and but it goes further than that. It results in attacks of one group on another, and that's where the thing goes badly wrong. So you get this difference. You get this real deep dualisms in society between small groups of people, very often fighting each other at the expense of real political problems, which is solving the real needs of real people in the real world, which is poverty, the lack of education and progress and opportunity. And so this stuff, I think, is very much a sort of the froth of a middle-class higher education view of the world as opposed to the real world. And that's where I think some of Lyotard was right, but the others were wrong here. And I think, I think there's you have something, there is something interesting. I wrote a thing called Post-Creation recently, picking up on the word postmodern, because I think actually we may be using technology in quite an interesting way to, when you look at AI actually producing music, why not? Maybe there's another more advanced, interesting views of aesthetics and art and human progress that involves technology. Why not? That isn't about the Heideggerian idea of going back to authenticity, but is actually about embracing the new, being a bit wilder, a bit punkish, and a bit, well, let's go for it here,
Yeah.
Let's open up creation, not to these simple oppositions of characters within texts, which seems very traditional in a way. Maybe there's new forms of art that will emerge from all this. That excites me.
I read your piece, and that idea of kind of, this endless sort of recombination through use of technology was very interesting. But it did make me think of Levi-Strauss, who was attacked by Derrida, not for this reason, but and there's a passage in the I think The Savage Mind, as it was translated. It doesn't translate very well nowadays. Where he's talking about the contrast between an artist and a bricoleur. And a bricoleur is somebody who just assembles bits of things that have already been made by somebody else and puts it into some new form.
Exactly.
And he says that is bricolage.
It is.
And that is distinct from high art, in that high art is, the painter grinds his colors and starts from kind of basic principles and creates a work of art. And actually, that's not how people create works of art. Books speak about the books. People put things together out of other bits. And you see this endless recombination of past traditions.
Correct.
Well, obviously, you can see it in kind of, in modern music, EDM, sampling, bits of samples used here and there. I keep coming across tunes from the 50s by Lalo Schifrin and people like that. I think, what is that? That's Portishead. No, that's a sample, But then when you get into practical criticism, which I mentioned earlier, and you look very closely at the texts of poets back in the, Romantic poets, even of Shakespeare's time, there is an endless recombination of things that have come before.
Oh, yes.
Shakespeare is doing this with classical sources and so on. So that kind of, it's not only to me, but to a lot of people, Levi-Strauss's distinction there is completely illusory. And, AI is just allowing us to do more what arts and culture has always done.
Well, no, because it doesn't do bricolage. It doesn't sample in any way. It's the very opposite of that. There is no sampling. It's fresh. Every word, every piece of an image is freshly minted. This is what makes it more interesting than the bricolage idea, which I think is fundamentally right, which is what that piece was about, really, moving beyond that into new forms of art as yet unimagined. Things like, using AI, the recent stuff on Storyteller, where you're creating new forms of movies, even with the help of AI, and that's a human interaction in there in the loop as well. But we don't know what this is yet. I don't think that was my point, but it's more exciting perhaps than the bricolage idea, I think. But who knows?
Yeah, maybe I missed the point. And it will be interesting to see what AI produces, and it will be interesting to see what questions people come up with based on this conversation, and in fact all the conversations in our 6 seasons. So get those questions coming in. And this has been a very interesting ride for me, Donald. It's almost a shame to bring it to an end. I would say thank you very much to you for your time in doing this today.
Thank you, John. That was good fun. Once again, great fun.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and we thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. If you'd like text summaries and transcripts for these podcasts, as well as ads-free listening, early access to episodes and more, why not join the Learning Hack Pack? For less than the price of a coffee, you can get all these benefits and help to sustain us into the future. Go to patreon.com/learninghack for a 7-day free trial. That's patreon.com/learninghack.